Colin, if I want to understand consciousness, which is one of the fundamental characteristics, certainly, of our existence, I can introspect, and it seems like I can get a full grasp on what consciousness is. And then, of course, since Freud, we're told that there's a subconscious that is motivating various kinds of things. You talk about a third level, a hidden form of consciousness. What's that all about?
Well, the idea of the hidden structure of consciousness, as I call it, is there's a surface to consciousness which is apparent to you in introspection. And then far beneath that, there's the brain. Between those two levels, you've got a structure of consciousness which mediates between those two levels. So we normally think that everything real about consciousness is presented to us introspectively. I'm questioning that idea and suggesting that consciousness itself, intrinsically to it, possesses an articulation which links it to the brain. And without that kind of articulation, it would be a miracle that the brain and consciousness were connected at all, because there has to be something which mediates these two very different levels.
Because they're so different in primary
Because they're so
character.
different, yeah.
Okay, so now what are some of the components of that internal level? I mean, what progress can we make in understanding that hidden level?
Well, that's where I think we don't make very much progress at that hidden level. It's really a point about where the mystery is located. It's located at that hidden level. There are two possible positions. One position would be the missing properties that we don't know about belong to the brain and not to consciousness, but they explain consciousness. I think the trouble with that view is there has to be something about consciousness itself which links it to the brain, so the hidden properties. So I suggest instead the hidden properties are actually hidden properties of consciousness, so that there's more to consciousness than meets the eye.
Oh.
And those hidden properties, if we knew what they were, and maybe we can't know what they are, they provide the explanatory link between consciousness as we introspect it and the brain as we perceive it.
So if we start with a scientific obvious assumption that consciousness and brain states are the same in the so-called identity theory, and then we show that that may not be philosophically as robust as some neuroscientists may think, because they're very different characters, and say, okay, something about one side or the other has to mediate. And you're saying, rather than being some special physical properties of the brain that we don't understand, maybe it's some properties about consciousness. Well, what could even that possibly be like? I mean,
well, I can give you an analogy which probably influenced me in coming up with the idea. In linguistics, Chomsky and the other linguists postulated, in addition to the surface structure of language, a surface grammar, a deep structure for explanatory reasons. And they found that within sentences which have the same surface structure, there can be an identical deep structure. And that actually plugs into psycholinguistics, because the processing of language which we do when we hear a sentence and understand it involves manipulating this deep structure. And you can't get a good explanatory theory by limiting yourself only to the surface structure. So it's that kind of thing, except that I think in the case of consciousness, we don't really have any good conception of what the deep structure involves.
So in that case, in language, there's these deep structural concepts that are somehow embedded within the brain, but are like categories that apply to all different languages, and all people have that in a natural way. So we're not a totally blank slate, tabula rasa. There's some things there that things get formed upon. So you're suggesting that in consciousness, there may be some analog of the same thing, even though we can't say what it is.
That's right. And in the linguistics case, the deep structure really is an intrinsic property of a sentence or of a proposition or of a meaning. It's not that it's what they calling the deep structure is a property of the brain alone, which then enables us to understand a surface structure sentence. Rather, the sentence itself, the meaning itself, is layered in its reality, has a surface and it has a deeper part, and that belongs intrinsically to the meaning. And when we grasp the meaning, that hidden level is part of our ability to grasp that meaning. It's that kind of model that I'm using.
So in that case, to try to extrapolate it, difficult as it is, we would then say that consciousness has some hidden aspects that is just richer conceptually than what we imagine, which is just the perceptions, the phenomenological perceptions that we have.
Correct. I mean, in other analogy, you're looking at, say, color. Color looks very uniform and monotonous when you see a red surface of something. But if you're trying to understand the way color works, you have to postulate a very detailed fine structure in the surface, don't you? And it involves all of atomic theory and the theory of light and the theory of the spectrum and so on. So it's quite complex. The underlying reality of a simple red surface is a complex reality, but you need to postulate it, otherwise you can't really explain why a surface is uniformly red. So in the same way, you may have a sensation which is quite simple, a sensation of somebody sticks a pin in you. It may be that there's a rather complex hidden structure in the sensation itself, the phenomenology of it, which links it to the basis in the neurons. That's the picture.
Some philosophers would say that consciousness is very interesting, but really it's just the product of different systems in the brain. And you can see this if you're focusing on something visual, you don't hear things, and if you're hearing things or you sleep. So we have all these different systems that have evolved for different reasons in evolution. And we have maybe a mechanism of focus through the brainstem, the reticular activating formation. We're focusing on different things. So what we have, this illusion of a binding together of all of these different things, is really just kind of a competition within the brain between these different perceptual systems, and there's really no problem there at all. We're just imagining it.
Well, I think this touches on the question of the so-called unity of consciousness. So far, we haven't really discussed that as an essential feature of consciousness at all. When we talk about subjectivity and so on, that could belong to a fragmented consciousness.
Right, right.
You know, if it was fragmented into my tactual sensations, my visual sensations, and then my cognitive conscious thoughts and so on, those could be very fragmented with no sense of unity. Still, there'd be a problem about relating them to the brain, because individually they aren't the kinds of things that you can find in the brain. So the most there could be that was an illusion from what we say so far is that the unity was illusory.
Yes.
But there is a problem of principle even with that, because if there's an impression of unity, then there's some unity somewhere, right? Because you feel unified. Where does that feeling of being unified come from? Even if there is no unity, there's got to be an account of that. So somehow or other we feel ourselves to be unitary beings. Well, we must be unitary beings, at least at the level of how it seems to us that we are. So how do we haven't accounted for that. So it's no doubt true that in a sense our consciousness at any given moment is a fragmented affair, because of course it's made up of the sensations I feel in my feet right now, the thoughts I'm having, the visual sensations. Of course there are many aspects to it, but at the same time there's also a sense that each of these aspects belongs to me, the thing I refer to by saying I, and I've never seen any good argument from neuroscience or anywhere else really to show that that's an illusion, that somehow these things don't converge on and belong to a single entity called I, whatever that may be.
So are we then talking about two broad categories of trying to understand the essence or mystery of consciousness? One is, how does any individual perception or cognitive feeling have this sense of I and self and subjectivity? And the second question, kind of related but independent too, is how do all these things unify in those two separate issues?
They're two very different questions. And unity is just one aspect of consciousness. There's still, you see, let's take intentionality, which is just the ability of a mental state to be about something. That's going to be there no matter how fragmented the conscious life is at any given time. And that's already going to be a problem for a simple identity theory, because brain states don't appear to have intentionality. They aren't about things. They just interrelate with others, any more than cells in the heart have intentionality.
But why does intentionality have to... Isn't that something we're just reading into it?
I don't think so, because again, there's this regress problem. If we're just reading it in, that itself is intentionality, because we're reading something in that requires intentionality. Intentionality is a very fundamental aspect of our minds, because intentionality is what it makes language possible. Unless language referred to things in the world, we couldn't talk about things by speaking. So if I say to you, this chair is made of wood, that's intentionality. It's also absolutely basic to perception, because perceptions are of things in the external world. If they weren't, what use would they be? That's the whole point of them, is to be about things in the external world, give information about those things. So intentionality is a very basic characteristic of the mind.
So this is the third aspect that we have to deal with. We have to deal with the subjectivity of perceptions and cognition. We have to deal with this unity, real and now we have to deal with this aboutness. The
aboutness is a very basic question.
This is a complicated thing, this consciousness.
It's very complicated, and then there's non-spatiality is another aspect of it. Now, the question we haven't touched on really, though I think you hinted at it at the beginning, is there a single essence that everything called consciousness possesses? So people say, what's the essence of consciousness? That, I think, is a misleading question, because there's such variety within the realm of consciousness. Take the difference between a sensation of pain and a thought about philosophy, or an act
Sometimes
of will.
those are the same.
They can, the one can cause the other, definitely. But then also you've got self-consciousness versus ordinary consciousness. You've got cognitive states, emotional states. There's a great variety there, and there may not be a single thing we can single out as the essence of all of them, something they all have in common. That doesn't mean we're not entitled to classify them all together. Maybe the truth is that we all know what consciousness is immediately anyway. We don't need a definition. I mean, certainly people don't have any trouble with the word. They can talk about it quite easily. Not all words can be defined anyway. So it's a bit of a potentially dangerous question to say, well, tell me the essence of consciousness before I'll believe in consciousness. First of all, there may not be a single essence. Everything is consciousness, and that everything conscious has. And also, why should we suppose it has a definition anyway? Maybe it doesn't have a definition.